Hi there, my name's Bruce Rain from Brankus Creations, and in this video we're going to be recapping a Macintosh SE 30. Just a quick reminder that if you like this video, please subscribe to my channel. Okay, so the backstory is this. A customer has sent me a Macintosh SE 30 logic board, and it currently doesn't work. Now, he has already had this recapped. I don't know if he did it himself or he got someone else to do it, but at the end of the day, he's not happy with the recapping job, and of course the computer still doesn't work, so he sent it to me to redo. Now, the purpose of this video is not to kind of roast or shame whoever did the recapping before. That's not what I'm about. Obviously, one of the things I do, one of the reasons I make these videos is to encourage people to actually go out and do this sort of work themselves. And obviously, you know, sort of you will get better at it as you go. But what I do want to do is I want to have a look at this and see if I can identify any areas where I can sort of suggest improvements so that the recapping might be done a little bit better. So we're going to have a look at this under the microscope and just have a look at the work that was done and see if there are any inherent problems with it. And then of course we're going to take all the caps off and do them all again. Now, just a little bit more information about what is actually wrong with this board. It is suffering from something that is often referred to as simasimac. It's a term created, I think, in the early days of the SE 30 failures, and apparently the origin of the word is the Japanese word for zebra is simasima. Now, I apologise if there's anyone who speaks Japanese and is swearing at the screen right now. Don't shoot the messenger. I'm only relaying the information that I had at hand. It might actually be rubbish, but the point is that simasimac is a very generalised term given to a Macintosh SE 30 that's not working and is displaying, you know, vertical white lines, black and white lines, or a sort of strange kind of black and white pattern like this. Now, it's a very, very broad issue. When you get something like this happening, it's a little bit like the engine light coming up on your car. It's not actually telling you what's wrong with the car, it's just telling you there is something wrong. And it's the same with that. It's not like when you see that pattern come up on the screen, it's like, oh, okay, no worries, we've got to replace this chip or we've got to fix that trace or something. It's a very, very broad problem, and it's, you know, it's all it's really telling you is there's something wrong with your computer. Now, obviously, when this happens, the very first thing you should do is recap your computer, because chances are you're getting that problem because of leaky electrolytic capacitors. But this has already been recapped, so the problem is somewhere else. Or it might be with the actual recapping job. We'll find that out as we go. So what we're planning to do here is obviously recap this board and see if we can identify what might be causing that simasimac error. So the next thing to do is to have a look at it under the microscope. All right, so let's start here. This is one of the capacitors that has been recapped. Look, there's a little bit of junk left over. I mean, the first thing that I can identify here is that this has not been properly cleaned even after the recap. And that would be something that I would say, you know, is an essential thing. Whenever you're recapping a board, it has to be thoroughly cleaned afterwards, because it's all very well to replace the caps, but if there's still residual electrolyte on the board, it can be creating shorts and, you know, and corroding traces and stuff like that. So the first step obviously is replacing the caps, but the boards have to be clean. So that's certainly one thing that I can identify straight off the bat. These blobs of solder aren't super good. Okay, so this here, it looks like the 1 microfarad 50 volt capacitor. It's a little bit on the small side, but what I can identify is I don't think this pad was ever adequately cleaned. So again, that's another really important part of the recapping process, is making sure that those pads are squeaky clean. The thing is that when it comes to soldering, I've actually done a video on you know, sort of soldering before, on, you know, basic soldering. There'll be a link coming up on the screen somewhere as I say this. The issues that you often encounter with soldering are if solder is not sticking to what you want it to stick to. The problems are either the soldering iron is not up to temperature. The solder has oxidized, and we combat that by using flux, or the surfaces are not clean. And so if you're having trouble with solder not attaching itself to what you want it to attach to, you've got to address one or all of those issues. It could be that your soldering iron's not making good contact with what you're actually trying to solder, and so you're not transferring enough heat to it. It could be that those pads are really grubby. I mean, when you take these old capacitors off, it leaves all this residual gunk behind, and when you hit that with a soldering iron, that gunk virtually just forms a film on top, and you'll never get solder onto it. And then, of course, what people end up doing to combat that issue is they put loads and loads of solder on, and that's where you end up with sort of a bit of a blob like this, where someone's sort of just putting more and more solder on to compensate for the fact that they're not actually getting, a reasonable join. So that you need to make sure that they're clean. And then, as I say, oxidizing is a really important thing to keep in mind. When you put solder onto a soldering iron, it from the moment it is exposed to the air in that molten fashion, it starts to oxidize, and it ends up with a film on the outside. And you use flux to combat that. So you need to make sure you're putting ample flux on there to help that solder flow and stop it from, getting a crispy film on the outside, which will make your joints look ugly. So, go liberal with the flux. So, okay, so we've really identified a couple of things here. Not properly cleaned joints, and the board wasn't cleaned. And as I say, this here is a bit smaller than I would put on in terms of the capacitor. I'm sure it's the right rating, but I will put a bigger one on when I replace that. So that's I mean, these are a little bit wonky in terms of their positioning, but look, that's real nitpicking. That's not a major issue. Let's have another look at that one. And of course, as I move down here, I can identify some issues here. When you look at that, you can clearly see that there's a lot of residue still here. All of these chips in a line, I'm just going to bring here, there are a line of chips along here, all along there, and they're all related to the display. So if you're having display issues, it can often be because the electrolyte has leaked from those down onto those chips there. So we've got electrolyte here, and we've got things like, for instance, if I zoom in on this, sorry for the out of focus, that looks pretty ugly. We'll definitely need to double check that and make sure that, sort of we've got continuity there, because that could be corroded all the way through. We've got more along here. You can see sort of, I'll just get some tweezers. You've got there, and another one there. So, we will be looking at testing all of those to make sure that they're okay. But these are the chips that live underneath these electrolytic capacitors up here, and so all that funk sort of rolls down onto them. There's another one that really doesn't look too crash hot just there. So there's that. Now let's move across to here. There's another one. I don't like the look of that. We've got a little bit of residual. There's a nice little solder bead there. Yeah, I'm not particularly happy with the look of that. We'll have to double check that. But once again, we've just got, this pad has not been adequately prepared and cleaned, ready for the new component to go on. So we'll need to do that. This one here, again, same problem. Pad's not cleaned. And another one here. And that's got a, yeah, again, that pad's not cleaned. So that's really definitely something that we we'll do with this one. We'll take these off and we'll clean them properly, as per my other recapping videos. Nothing new there, all aware of that. But what I do want to do now is I want to just go in and check some of these sort of traces that look like they might not be any good. So if we go down to here, there we go. You can see there's this black section here, which is usually an indication of a rotten or corroded trace. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab my little multimeter here and set it on beep for continuity. Now, what we'll do is we'll start with one that doesn't look too bad. And here's one that doesn't look too bad. Okay, that goes to this pin over here. So I'm going to put one probe on this pin, and then we'll go back to there, and I'll put one probe on this pin. Come on, where are you? There. Okay, well, we're getting a beat. So there is continuity going on there for that one. Now this one here, this one goes straight to a via, which means it goes through onto the other side of the board. Now I'm going to do a little cheat here. I'm just going to get a scalpel and I'm going to scrape away a little bit of the coating to reveal some copper here, which I've just revealed on the top right hand of that via. And when I have finished doing this work, I will recoat that with some UV solder mask to protect that copper. Okay, so I'm going to put one pin there on there, one probe there. Okay, well, we've got continuity for that one as well, so that's good. So even though these ones look pretty nasty, we are getting continuity. But I am going to have to go through and test all of these. And as you can see, there are quite a few that look ugly. So I'm going to have to go through and do all of those. Here's another one. Once again, just expose a teensy-weensy little bit of copper here. Like that. Put the probe there. And, that's an interesting one. No beep. No beep on this one at all, which would suggest to me that we have a rotten trace through there. And that's a good thing to find, because that could well be the cause of our problem. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to scrape away from the top of this. Yeah, look at can you see that rust there? You can see the colour. That should be a nice bright copper colour, but it's a yucky sort of brown rust colour. So we've got to keep scraping away, and then we'll have to create a new trace there. So the other thing I can identify here is this looks like it's been exposed to some heat, because these the solder here is looking kind of crunchy, and by that I mean it's been heated underneath, and there's been maybe some hot air, and it's sort of the molten stuff inside has leaked out and left this sort of film on top. And so I am probably going to actually remove this chip completely, and then I'm going to clean all of the pads, and then I'm going to put it back on. So let's do that now, because that's a little bit more interesting than recapping. So let's get some flux all over these. The flux will help that solder flow. All right. Now, I've got plastic here, these little dip chips that are sort of sitting in a little holder. Okay, so all right, I'll put my steel there to shield the heat right there, and then I'm just going to apply some heat. I'm not concerned too much about the heat hitting those sort of capacitors above it, because I'm going to remove them anyway. Okay, just applying the heat, melting those, focusing. You see all of the little beads starting to come out? There we go. All right, so off comes that chip. And you can see that all of those pads look pretty awful. So, next step, again, add some more flux. And I'm going to introduce some fresh solder with the old solder. And that's also part of the cleaning process. So, let's get some fresh solder here. Now, see that? Remember I was talking about how when you've got gunk on it, as soon as you hit it with heat, you get a film? That's the film I'm referring to. You can see it's sort of completely and totally black over top now. And that's what we've got to get rid of. We've got to get rid of all that film. So just light circular motion here with some fresh solder over these pads. We're trying to remove the black gunk without removing the pad. and that we're just doing this with a combination of the heat and the solder and the flux. And you can actually see it is having an effect. These are starting to look a lot shinier. So I'm just going to keep going with these. Some of them will be too stubborn. Some of them will need extra work. But we definitely have cleaned these up a bit. Okay. Okay, back up there. Just trying to keep this in focus. Again, let's get out new solder there. Nice big blob of solder. Heat and flux and solder. Just trying to get rid of as much of that as possible. Much of the black gunk as possible. These ones have actually come up better, and that's because these are further away from the capacitor leakage. Okay, so the next thing is to grab my solder wick, which I have in my hand here, my solder John wick, and I'll put this on here, and we will lift up all that old solder and new solder that I've added, as well as gently rubbing these pads. And I do mean gently, because a computer of this age with this sort of corrosion, we could easily lift up a pad and then I would have to do a repair, and I really don't want to have to. Okay. Okay. Now, we're a lot better, but we're still not perfect. I do apologise for doing that whole thing outside of camera. Through my viewfinder here, I can actually see quite a lot more than gets captured on camera. So I end up sometimes doing things and they're not on camera. Sorry about that. Okay, so after a little bit of clean with after a little bit of a clean with some isopropyl alcohol there, we can see that the majority of these have come up all right, but we do have some problems. We got this one over here, and so I'm going to just scrape away at this blank gunk with a curved scalpel blade, and I'm just looking to take that off and hopefully just reveal copper behind it. This one is bad. This one is very bad. Just need to be gentle but firm. Okay, a little bit here. Gentle but firm. Yeah, at the end of the day, they don't have to be perfectly pristine. You know, they just need to be able to take solder. And this one here, I don't think I'm going to be able to get that one perfect, but we'll just see how we go. There we go. Scrape, 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 scrape. I think my blade's starting to get a little bit old here. Let's have a look at it. Yeah, it's in a terrible state. So time for me to replace this blade. Okay, out with the old blade, in with the new blade. So these are actually surgical scalpels. They come in little sort of sealed little sleeves like this. They are insanely sharp because they are specifically designed for cutting open skin. So you have to be super, super careful with them. But after a while, they start to get chips on the end of the blade, and this one here is nice and smooth, as you can see. So now I'm going to get back to doing a little bit of scraping. Yeah, it's much better. Much smoother. Okay, let's do a little bit more here. Okay, so now the one that was broken was, I think, this one here, and there you can clearly see that break now that we've got solder on it from there to there. So I'm going to have to replace that with a wire, which is fine. And I don't like the look of this one either. Let's have a close up of that and see if that's as bad. Yeah, that one looks pretty ugly. I think that's still joined, but I will run a wire for that one anyway, because I just don't like the look of it. Okay. All right. So let's just clean that. Well, actually, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll just get some solder onto those cleaned pads, so that I've just got a little bit of. Actually, I'll do it from here. I was just going to use the residual solder on that wick, but don't want to crash on. Need some flux. Okay. Still looks so ugly, doesn't it? Okay. All right. That'll do it. And then get all that solder off. Now, we still have a problem, and that is that the component itself looks pretty darn ugly as well. So I'm just going to zoom into that a bit, and what I'm going to try and do is, again, I'm going to get some flux all over this, like that, and I'm going to get a great big massive solder on the end of my soldering iron, and then I'm going to, with some tweezers, just hold this still. And I'm going to just run this backwards and forwards. This doesn't have to be perfect, because the stuff underneath these pins, which is what's going to adhere to the board, is probably not too bad. But I just want to try and clean these up as much as I can. So just trying to get all that old gunk off. Do the same for this side. Once again, get a little bit of flux on there. And clean those up as best as I can. Okay, there we go. Let's take our little component and we'll put him to one side and go back to our freshly prepared pads, and we will just clean them up again with some isopropyl alcohol. Get rid of all the gunk. Okay. Get our component, drop him on. Actually, get some flux on there first. There we go. Nice big liberal amount of flux. Don't be shy using flux. And then we just need to put this on with the little dot. You can see there's a little dot just there, indicates pin 1. We want pin 1 to line up with that white dot there. That indicates pin 1, that indicates pin 1. So we just need to make sure they line up. Sometimes they're not a dot, sometimes they're done with a stripe. Yeah, it's either a stripe or a dot. I'll let you know which is pin 1. And the beauty of these old Mac boards is they were all labelled with, you know, little pins showing where pin 1 is, sometimes even the pin numbers. When you're working on modern Macs, the boards are completely blank. So if you don't have like a board view, you're stuffed. Okay, so when I'm putting on a component, a surface mount component, I always get flux onto it, drop the component on there. Flux helps keep the component still. Then I tack on one, just one. Doesn't matter which one. Yep. Actually, I'm going to do it while holding it still with the tweezers. There's plenty of flux here, so the solder should just melt. There we go. Okay, so that's now tacked on with one pin. Now we'll tack it on with a second pin on the opposite side, like that. Okay, so that is now holding in position for me to then go in and do the rest of them. Now I'm going to do something here that a lot of people say don't do. I'm going to drag solder. Drag, drag, drag. Apparently it's bad. Drag. But works for me. Okay, so there we've now got all these pins attached. And what I'm going to do now is just use my multimeter to just check and see after that work whether I might have actually re-established contact with these things, because there might be a bit of fresh solder there now. So let's put solder there, put that there. Nope. Nope. So we are going to have to do trace repairs for that one and for that one. Now what I would typically do with that, I mean, I can just go the easy way and just run a tiny little wire from there to there, or if I wanted to go further, I can actually run it right through the hole and through to the other side, and you know, sort of, actually with this one it doesn't really matter, I can just attach it to, I can just attach it all the way along here. This one, I might run it all the way through, but this one here, because we've got a trace going along there, that gives me, I think, enough distance to get a wire secure. So let's get some solder onto the copper there. There we go. Right, and then we need to get our wire, which, here it is. There we go. And I'm just using very, very thin, what is it, sort of like transformer wire. It's enameled wire, and when I apply heat to it, that enamel will melt. I use enameled wire because it means that I can run these, because that means they're insulated, so I can run these across the board without fear of creating shorts. But the enamel does come off nice and easily when you apply heat to it. So I've got to try and get this in position. I'm going to apply some heat to melt that off. There we go, that's melting the enamel off. Nearly there. There we go. Okay, well, that's pretty much it. Let me just cut that little excess off. And there is a trace repair. It's not my prettiest, and I might even tidy it up a little before people start talking. So, once again, just wanting to, right, we need flux. There, that's better. I like the look of that. Okay, so there's one little trace repair there, and then with this one here, I need to go through to the other side. Well, I want to go through to the other side. I don't have to, but I just think I will get a better repair. Now, the big problem with these holes is they're filled up with solder mask. So I've got a needle here, and I'm going to try and poke a hole in that solder mask. Boom. Oh, I think I've done it. Yep, I've poked a hole in it. That's great. So now let's see if I can feed some wire through that hole. Whether it might be blocked on the other side as well, but we'll try it first. Okay, so I've fed that wire through to the other side. Then I've just got to bend it over here and attach it to here. Okay, just get some solder, hold my tweezers, and there we go. Whoop. There we go, that's nice. And just cut the top off. Boop. Come on. Okay, then we've just got to join it on the other side. So flip that one over. Okay, so this trace doesn't actually go anywhere, which means that it's actually going somewhere inside the board. It's going on one of the other layers inside this board. So all I really need to do is just get that secure. As I say, it's just about creating these repairs so that they're going to last. I want to make sure that everything is on, you know, sort of, we're not just going to end up with a situation where, you know, sort of a couple of weeks after doing the repair, it breaks. Okay, so there's that one all done. Sorry about, again, the lack of focus. Cut that off and flip him back over again, and we'll just double check it's still good at this side. There we go. Okay, so it's still joined at that side. So that's 2 trace repairs on this UD8 chip. I'm pretty sure the others are okay. They certainly look okay. Okay, so that's all for the moment. Now I'm going to take all those capacitors off, all the old capacitors off. We'll have a look at the pads underneath those capacitors and any of the traces around the capacitors to see if there are any issues there. So I'm just going to do that now, but I'm not going to film it because that would be very boring. Okay, so all the caps are off, and just looking at the pads here, as I say, they sort of haven't really been cleaned particularly well, so we're going to do that now. There's one there. Okay, so one of the things we're going to be looking out for is any damage to traces around the components. So, for example, here there's a trace that runs right down the middle of the 2 pins of this capacitor. Now, if during this process that gets damaged, either exposed or damaged, if it gets exposed, that you run the risk of potentially accidentally making contact with one of these pins when you put it on there. So that's one thing that I'll be looking out for, is to see how they look. Let's jump across to these ones. These look okay. We've got this. Here's an interesting one just here. There is, at some stage, something has been sort of jabbed into this board right where that trace is, and I think it's still making contact, but it's not good. So I'm probably going to, at the very least, put some solder on that, or I might end up having to put a wire there. But that's an interesting one. So that sort of someone's dropped something sharp onto there or something like that. Again, you know, with this one here, if, like, say for instance, this trace here were to get exposed, and you then get your capacitor and you put this on here, if this is a little bit up that way, and the pin on the other side of this one here, there touches like an exposed bit of trace there, that can create a short. And that's something that's very easy to do on these SEs, IC30s. You know, as say, if one of these gets damaged and exposed, you can then create an accidental short. I don't see that happening here anywhere. All of these traces still seem to be together, but that's one of the things you need to look out for. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is clean up these pads using the same method I use with all of my videos. I basically start off by putting some flux on them. I then add some new solder. And circular motion, very gentle circular motion with the heat, the flux, the new solder, like that. And then I come back with my solder wick and I clean away that new solder, and I leave nice, clean, shiny pads all ready for adding new solder to. Now, as you can see, looking at that, they look like new. I mean, not really, but you know, they look good. We won't have any problem when we put the new component on that. We'll only need to use a tiny little bit of solder because we'll get really good adhesion. Okay, so I'm now going to do that with the rest of the pads. Once again, not going to film it, too boring, but I'm going to go through and clean up all of these pads one at a time. Okay, so I've removed all of the caps and I have cleaned up all of the pads. I've also removed the UE8 chip, which I'll just show you here, and cleaned up the pads and then put the chip back on. I have, let's just move along to here. I've put that little nick in the trace that was there under this capacitor. I've put a little trace repair there, and then I've coated it with some UV solder mask to protect it. There's a couple of other areas where the traces have been just sort of nicked a bit, and I've just put solder mask on them to protect them. As you can see, all these pads look, you know, nice and clean. They're all ready for new components to go on. One of the axial capacitors had this rather nasty damage to the hole, but I don't think that's going to be a problem. I think we should be okay. So that's pretty much it for that. I am ready to start putting new components on this, and once they're all on, we'll test it out and see how it goes. Okay, so I've finished replacing all of the capacitors on this board. So if we have a look here, you can see that all these joints are looking a lot cleaner now. The solder looks much smoother. There's none of that real sort of speckled black stuff on the pads. So those joins are all nice and clean. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to take this and power it up and see if it works. It hasn't been cleaned yet, but I am curious to see whether those trace repairs I did are the reason why it wasn't working before. So I'm going to just test it out now. If it's still failing, I will clean the board and then test it again to see whether the failure is caused from some, you know, residual gunk on the board. And if it still doesn't work, then I'll have to go in and sort of start hunting for some more broken traces. But the next thing I'm going to do is plug it into the SE, into the case, and see if it works. Okay, so I have installed the recapped logic board into this Macintosh SE30, and we're now going to check and see if it has been fixed. We've got a chime. That's a very good sign. And we've got the happy face, and we're loading welcome to Macintosh. So it obviously was those damaged traces, and repairing those seems to have fixed the problem it had before. And it's obviously got a nice new set of caps on it. And once I've cleaned it, it will come up looking like this. So a successful recap. Thank you for watching.